What if I told you there's a single data-backed strategy that increases the chance of ending a violent conflict by nearly 30%?
Right.
But, and here's the crazy part, world leaders and global institutions actively ignore that strategy, like 98% of the time.
It sounds completely made up, honestly, like I don't know, a diplomatic fairy tale,
Yeah.
a magical blueprint for world peace that everyone just somehow forgot to read. But the empirical data we have proves this isn't just a theoretical exercise. There is an actual verified mechanics to resolving disputes, whether you're dealing with a civil war or a hostile corporate takeover.
And that is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We are exploring this ultimate framework for dispute resolution, and it's based on this massive, almost unprecedented moment of global consensus.
Yeah, which is where?
Super rare. So to do that, we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources today. First, we've got the executive summary from the 80th UN General Assembly Open Debate.
From June 1st, 2026.
Exactly. And that was entirely dedicated to strengthening international mediation. Then, to see if the politicians' promises actually hold up to scientific scrutiny, we are looking at this massive academic synthesis. Researchers took over 150 million papers.
Which is just a staggering number to even think about.
I mean, how do you even start? But they filtered them down, and they analyzed the top 50 studies on mediation effectiveness.
And that's where we get the hard numbers, the real math behind the diplomacy.
Right. And finally, to bring all this geopolitical theory down to earth, we're looking at a brilliant article from the DC Mediation and Dispute Resolution Institute, because they translate this global framework into practical steps you can use in your everyday life.
Because human conflict scales.
Yeah, right.
From the UN Security Council straight down to your own living room.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the absolute highest level of international diplomacy to really grasp the scale of what happened on June 1st. So there are 193 member states in the UN General Assembly. Historically, getting 193 governments to agree on the color of the sky is an uphill battle.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, getting 193 people to agree on a pizza topping is nearly impossible, let alone a unified, actionable strategy for global conflict resolution.
It genuinely defies the usual gridlock. I mean, during this open debate, country after country took the floor and overwhelmingly agreed that mediation must be at the absolute heart of peaceful dispute settlement.
Which is huge.
It is. What's most telling about the June 1st debate is what didn't happen. There were no major disagreements.
Wait, really? None?
None. No state publicly challenged the overall mediation agenda.
Yeah.
They only differed in, where they wanted to put their funding and their specific focus.
Well, the urgency driving that consensus makes sense. The delegation from Qatar pointed out a pretty grim reality. They noted that the world is currently facing the highest number of armed conflicts today.
Yeah, they're really driving home the point that preventative diplomacy is not just, some idealistic luxury. It's a critical, immediate necessity.
Right. And out of this massive debate, 3 core pillars emerged. First, boosting resources and professionalization. Second, advancing inclusivity. And third, creating multi-level coordination.
Right.
You had countries like Pakistan heavily advocating for early diplomacy and a much stronger UN mediation architecture. And then Germany was pushing hard for continued, predictable financial commitment.
Because funding is always the sticking point.
Always. But I have to play the skeptic here for a second. Is this just diplomatic lip service? Because we know politicians are incredibly skilled at standing at a podium and talking about peace. Is there real substance and actual money behind these statements, or is it just a massive photo op?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the academic literature actually calls out that exact same tension.
Yeah.
But it also proves why these specific pillars, especially the push for resources, are so incredibly vital. The synthesis of those 50 top research papers confirms this isn't just rhetoric. When you look at the UN's Mediation Support Unit or their standby team of senior mediation advisors, the data shows they are demonstrably more cost-effective and flexible when they are properly resourced.
I'm curious, how does something like a standby team actually work in practice? Are they just sitting by a phone in Geneva waiting for a war to start?
Kind of, yeah. Think of the UN standby team like a roster of elite, on-call crisis paramedics.
Oh, okay.
When a conflict suddenly erupts, the traditional sort of ad hoc approach involves wasting 3 weeks negotiating who is going to pay for the flights, who the mediator will be, which hotel they'll stay in.
Oh, wow, that's terrible.
Right. And during those 3 weeks, a localized conflict can easily escalate into a full-blown regional crisis. But a well-resourced standby team is already funded. Their bags are packed. They can be on the ground in 72 hours with deep regional expertise.
That's a massive difference.
Exactly. The research shows a clear cause and effect relationship here. When mediators are backed by predictable, institutionalized funding, rather than, passing a hat around for donations after a crisis starts, the outcomes drastically improve. The global push right now is to permanently shift away from reactive improvising.
That is a massive paradigm shift. Because if you're scrambling to assemble a team after a conflict has already boiled over, you're already losing. You need that permanent infrastructure.
Exactly.
But having a well-funded team is only half the battle, right? We have to look at who is actually sitting on that team. And this brings us to the second pillar of the UN consensus, which honestly stopped me in my track.
The inclusivity pillar. This is where the gap between theory and practice becomes just glaringly obvious.
Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting and honestly incredibly frustrating. During the debate, the European Union and Germany highlighted this staggering statistic. When you include women in peace processes, it increases the chance of a lasting peace by roughly 30%.
30%, that's huge.
In international diplomacy, where failure means widespread devastation, a 30% boost is astronomical. But then you look at the bleak reality found in the academic synthesis. One major study found that between 1990 and 2017, only about 2% of led mediators in major negotiations were women.
2%.
2%.
It is the ultimate inclusion paradox. We have the data, we know what works, and yet the system consistently defaults to exclusion.
I am genuinely struggling to understand the logic here. If the data so clearly shows that including women and youth guarantees a 30% better success rate, why are governments and global institutions actively ignoring their own winning strategy?
It's a great question.
I mean, we even have formal binding commitments like UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which explicitly mandates women's equal participation. Are these institutions just getting in their own way by overcomplicating things?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can see exactly why this disconnect happens. And it really comes down to a fierce debate within the academic community about professionalization.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, on one hand, you have researchers who point out that professionalizing the mediation space raises standards. It creates necessary guidance documents, it codifies best practices, and it ensures that mediators actually understand the incredibly dense legal and logistical complexities of international treaties.
Which sounds completely reasonable. You wouldn't want an amateur performing surgery, so you shouldn't want an amateur negotiating a ceasefire.
True, but there's a dangerous flip side. Other scholars warn about the severe risks of hyperprofessionalization. When you make the entry requirements for mediation so rigid-like, heavily reliant on specific academic degrees or decades of high-level statecraft experience, you inadvertently depoliticize these incredibly complex realities.
Wait, unpack that for a second. How does a conflict get depoliticized by having professional mediators? Isn't a war inherently political?
It is, but hyper-professionalization treats conflict like a math equation rather than a human tragedy.
Oh, I see.
It means mediators come in with a rigid technical checklist, almost like accountants auditing a spreadsheet, and they completely ignore the messy, emotional human grievances that actually cause the violence in the first place.
Right, the human element gets lost.
Exactly. When you force a standardized technical template onto a human conflict, you end up relying solely on the traditional established power players who are almost exclusively male military generals or political leaders. In the rush to be efficient and professional, institutions accidentally sideline gender and inclusivity agendas because they view community inclusion as, like, a logistical headache.
It takes too much time to talk to civil society groups when you just want the generals to sign a piece of paper.
Precisely.
So they sacrifice a lasting peace just to get a quick signature. But inclusivity isn't just a moral courtesy. It sounds like it's a structural necessity for the agreement to hold any weight at all.
A structural necessity is the perfect way to frame it. Durable peace requires insider and community-based actors. Why? Because those are the people who actually have to live with the agreement after the international envoys pack up and fly back to New York.
That makes total sense.
If the local community wasn't at the table, they have no ownership over the peace. And if they have no ownership, the agreement will eventually be rejected and unravel completely.
Which brings us to the third pillar, the multi-level web of coordination. Because if local buy-in is that crucial, we have to understand how a grassroots effort on the ground actually connects to the global stage.
Right, the plumbing of it all.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I keep picturing this ideal coordination mechanism as a healthy nervous system. You have local mediators and civil society organizations at the grassroots level acting as the nerve endings. They're on the ground, feeling the immediate pain points, understanding the cultural nuances, and they feed that dialogue up to the national peace commissions, which relay it to regional organizations, which ultimately connects directly into the UN's brain, basically. And the communication has to flow seamlessly back down.
That nervous system was explicitly called for during the UN debate. The delegation from Timor-Leste made a very specific, passionate plea to integrate these levels. They
Oh.
know firsthand how vast the physical and bureaucratic distance is between a local village dispute and the UN Secretariat, and they begged for formal linkages to bridge that gap.
Wow.
And we are also seeing the growing importance of the regional level in that flow. The academic synthesis highlights how regional organizations like the African Union, the European Union, ASEAN, the Arab League are increasingly stepping in to work alongside the UN.
Why are those regional organizations so critical, though? Can't the UN just handle it directly?
Because multi-party mediation is now the standard. You rarely have a conflict today with just two sides and one mediator. You have neighboring states, proxy powers, international NGOs, private military contractors all involved.
It's a mess.
It is. Without a coordinated nervous system managed by regional experts who actually understand the geopolitical neighborhood, you just get severe fragmentation. You get different mediators stepping on each other's toes, offering contradictory deals, and parties forum shopping to find whichever mediator gives them the best terms.
I'm looking at the active mediation context cited in the sources, places like Syria, Ukraine, and the Gaza ceasefire talks. These are incredibly complex, internationalized crises where you have massive, immovable geopolitical alliances behind the local parties.
Absolutely.
So if a UN Security Council member uses their veto power to block a resolution, that multi-level nervous system we just talked about is basically severed at the spinal cord, isn't it? How does a mediator even walk into a room when the UN is fundamentally divided, or when the parties flat out refuse to consent to mediation?
That is the hard, sobering reality check embedded within the academic literature. There are absolute limits to diplomacy. A mediator, no matter how skilled, diverse, or well-resourced their team is, derives their power entirely from the party's willingness to engage. If consent is fragile, or if the UN Security Council is paralyzed by vetoes, the mediator's hands are effectively tied. They cannot force peace onto parties that are structurally incentivized or determined to keep fighting.
It feels like the system is rigged against the mediators in those high-stakes situations. If the Security Council gridlocks, the conflict just burns.
Which is why the research points heavily toward necessary institutional reform. For instance, there are proposals out there for creating a permanent, independent international mediation body.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the idea is to separate the core mediation function from the political gridlock of the Security Council. If you have an independent body, you ensure absolute neutrality, and you aren't beholden to the political whims or vetoes of the major powers.
That makes a lot of sense.
But even more practically, this highlights the absolute brilliance of the Bangladeshi delegation's call during the UN debate. They argued for much stronger investment in early warning systems.
Okay, what does an early warning system actually look like in diplomacy? Are we talking about monitoring social media feeds or tracking troop movements?
Both, along with tracking localized resource disputes, economic indicators, civil unrest. The goal of an early warning system is to catch the localized flare-up and deploy those elite, well-resourced mediation teams to solve it before it ever reaches the desk of the Security Council. You have to act while the dispute is small and there is still a baseline willingness to talk, rather than waiting for a full-scale crisis that triggers geopolitical vetoes.
Catch the spark before it becomes a forest fire.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've looked at the macro-level geopolitics. We've talked about UN standby teams, Security Council vetoes, hyper-professionalization. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? How do we bring this massive global blueprint out of the UN General Assembly and into your living room or your community board or your office?
This is where that DC Mediation and Dispute Resolution Institute article is so incredibly useful. It takes those three massive global pillars, resources, inclusion, and coordination, and demonstrates that human conflict scales. The exact same psychological dynamics, the need for trust, the barriers to communication that tear apart nations, are the exact same forces that tear apart business partnerships and families.
They made a brilliant point in that article that mediation should be a first response, not a last resort.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people default to aggressive escalation or litigation when they feel wronged.
Oh, definitely.
But using litigation as your first step is like using a sledgehammer to fix a leaky faucet. You're letting a rigid, unfeeling algorithm dictate your divorce or your business dissolution. A judge applies strict rules, the nuance is lost, and usually both parties end up miserable.
Yeah, nobody wins.
Right. Mediation, on the other hand, is like open source software. You and the other party actively code the agreement together.
Because you coded it together, you actually stick to it. The article points out a universal phenomenon they call the gap between consensus and action.
Tell me about that.
This happens at every level of human interaction. They talk about how carefully mediated community agreements or workplace settlements unravel all the time. Two managers will sit down, shake hands, declare the conflict resolved, but the agreement falls apart a week later because no one planned for the follow-through. They didn't build a mechanism to implement the changes.
So if you are listening to this and you know you have a tense office meeting coming up or maybe a really difficult conversation with a neighbor, how do you apply the UN's inclusive design to your own life without making it feel like, a massive bureaucratic exercise?
Well, this raises an important question for all of us about our own conflict resolution habits. The next time you find yourself managing a dispute, ask yourself how you are handling the resources and the environment. Are you ambushing your coworker by the coffee machine when they're visibly stressed and holding a stack of papers?
Oh yeah, the coffee machine ambush never ends well for anyone.
Never. Or have you actively resourced the conversation by setting aside 30 uninterrupted minutes in a neutral room? That's resourcing. Second, are you ensuring all affected voices are heard? Are you and your boss making a decision that severely impacts a junior employee who isn't even in the room to defend their workflow? Remember that 30% success bump that comes from genuine inclusion.
If they aren't at the table, they won't own it.
Exactly. If the people affected by the rule aren't at the table when the rule is made, they will actively resist it.
Yeah.
And finally, are you planning for long-term follow-through rather than just a quick, uncomfortable fix? Are you scheduling a check-in a week later or a month later to see if the agreement's actually holding up in practice?
It is surprisingly practical when you strip away the diplomatic jargon. The principles of resourcing, inclusion, and structured follow-through that resolve international wars are the exact same principles you need to resolve a standoff with your homeowners association.
They really are.
Human nature doesn't change just because the stakes get higher. The mechanics of building trust and the absolute requirement for structured accountability remain exactly the same.
Which is why understanding this global blueprint is so empowering. It removes the mystery from conflict resolution and replaces it with a deliberate, actionable methodology.
We have really journeyed through the spectrum today. We started on the grand halls of the UN General Assembly floor, where 193 nations agreed on a path forward. We dug into the hard empirical data proving that inclusivity and early preparation are the actual mathematical foundations of peace. And we brought it right down to how you can use this globally endorsed blueprint in your own life to step away from the rigid algorithms of escalation and start coding your own open source agreements.
And as we look to the future of this blueprint, there is one final open research question from the academic synthesis that I think is crucial to leave you with.
Let's hear it.
As our lives, our businesses, and our conflicts increasingly move into digital spaces, how will digital technologies and digital diplomacy reshape this entire process? When the mediation table is entirely virtual, will technology finally close that inclusivity gap and allow more localized, grassroots voices to be heard directly by the UN? Or, conversely, will mediating through a screen create new, invisible barriers to genuine human connection, making it even harder to build the deep trust necessary for true mediation?
That is a massive question to mull over. Can you truly mediate a complex, emotionally charged conflict over a video screen, or does peace require people to actually breathe the same air? It is definitely something to keep an eye on as the landscape of dispute resolution continues to evolve. Thank you for joining us as we unpack these sources today. We hope you walk away feeling a little more equipped to handle whatever conflicts come your way. Until next time, keep seeking to understand, keep pulling up chairs for those who need a voice at the table, and keep diving deep.